Hey there, Internet friends, and welcome to the first episode of That Ultimate Video Game List Show. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey from ThatNerdySite.com, and this is the show where each season, me and a panel of friends try to create the ultimate top 20 video game list with two main bits of criteria. Only one game per franchise, and only one game per console. Joining me for this inaugural season are three of my fellow nerds from That Nerdy Site, Logan Wilkinson.
Hey there, hi there, who there?
Cameron Abbott.
Popping open a cold one, boys. Let's go.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. What have I done? and Frank Bizzani.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
All right, everybody excited to get into this now that we all know how the rules are played. Cameron?
Yep.
Okay. So to introduce the audience to the show, you can find the show each and every week at That Nerdy Site and hopefully on all sorts of podcast services. Bear with us as we get this up and running. And please rate, review, like, and subscribe everywhere you can to help us get some traction as we roll this launch out. If you enjoy the chaos that you're about to hear, you can support us at patreon.com/thatnerdysite and help us keep bringing you these fun shenanigans. So the way the show works is like this. Each week, the panel will take turns adding a round of games to the list. Once a game is added, all other games from that franchise and that console are out of the running. Games can be submitted for any console that they've been released on, including remasters, but collections of games are not allowed. For example, you can fight for Halo 2 on the Xbox One as a part of the Master Chief Collection, but you can't fight for the Master Chief Collection itself. Additionally, each panelist has one veto that they can use to shoot down a game when it is submitted, keeping all other games of that franchise or console in the running. So if I wanted to put out the Ocarina of Time, but Logan's really in love with Breath of the Wild, he could shoot me down with a veto. If desired, however, the rest of the panel can come together to save a game by a unanimous veto override. So, if in that scenario Logan shoots me down with a veto, Cameron and Frank could join in and say, "No, we are going to say Ocarina of Time stays on the list," and Logan would lose his veto. So that's kind of the gist of Phase 1 of the game, which will last us for the next few weeks. Once we get out of Phase 1 and we have 20 games that have been selected, the panel we will then shift into ranking the list, and the top game at the end of Season 1, whatever game that may be, will be retired into the Hall of Fame and ineligible for future seasons of the show. So yeah, that's a quick rundown of kind of the basic gist of the rules. I have like a much more detailed version written out that will probably be somewhere on the site, but have not gotten that uploaded and ready to go if anybody wants to peruse like the nitty-gritty rules that I've gotten into, as well as an example of various consoles. We're not counting things like the PS4 and the PS4 Pro as separate consoles, but Cameron did pose the question before we started recording. PSVR will count as something unique from PS4. So we'll have some examples like that, and hopefully you guys don't throw any other curveballs at me that I have to figure out on the fly. So that's the show. So without further ado, we don't have, normally there will be like a recap of what we've done so far, but we have nothing to recap so far. So let us kick off round 1. We've pre-selected our order at random, and round 1 is going to kick off with Frank. So Frank, hit us with a game.
Yeah, so this was actually like the first game that kind of immediately came to mind when we were talking about this. And it was also a console I didn't think anybody else was really going to come in with anything for. I am going to go with Persona 4 Golden on the PS Vita.
Excellent choice. It was on my list of potential games for today as well. So Persona 4 Golden would take out any other Persona games from the running, and I imagine, at least among us, Persona 5 is probably the only other really notable one. I don't think too many of us have been delving back into the backlog of other Persona games, unless somebody's like a huge fan for Dancing All Night.
I have the platinum.
I mean, I've got the platinum for Persona 5.
I've never cared to platinum any other game besides Dancing All Night.
Nice.
It is known.
and then as you kind of point out, that would take out anything else from the Vita. And I'm trying to think of what other really big notable games are on the Vita that also
Golden Abyss,
couldn't
maybe.
be argued on other things. And yeah, Golden Abyss is probably
I thought
out
about
there.
I thought about Freedom Wars, but I was really like, man,
Yeah.
Persona is probably
Yeah.
the stronger game, honestly.
I would stand by that selection as well. Like if you wanted to say I don't want to put Persona 4 Golden on there, and you wanted to argue for Persona 5, Freedom Wars would be like a good Vita game down the line as kind of the future of this list as we get into some of the more in the weeds pulls I think we have to resort to. But other than that, yeah, Persona 4 Golden. So give me some background on like why you wanna pick that, why it's a game that should be on that ultimate video game list.
Oh man, yeah, that is definitely just like one of my favorite games of all time, and especially like I think it's one of the strongest in the Vita's catalog, and everybody says it's like one of the must buys. And like in terms of like, I think it just has such a great variety in terms of like the difference between like going between the school day to day and then the dungeon delving down there at night. And I like that all the dungeons are kind of like randomly generated, so it doesn't really get boring. Like I really hate grinding in things, especially like RPGs. And I feel like even though I did a lot of grinding in there to like get to level 99, it really wasn't like that bad, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Anybody else have any thoughts on Persona 4 Golden?
I personally think that even though Persona 5 is a really great game and it's super strong, and even the earlier iterations of Persona are fantastic, Persona 4 Golden, I think, is the gold standard for what a Persona game should be. So.
Yeah, excellent choice. For the audio listener, if any of Cameron's audio ends up coming in with some screaming children in the background, that is not because he's on To Catch a Predator, even though we were joking about that earlier. He just has his young nephews in the house, and they might be bleeding in a little bit. So just wanted to put that out there. But yeah, I think Persona 4 Golden is an excellent choice. The only reason I would be tempted to veto it are out of pure spite for the Rise trophy in that game.
Oh my
It is
God,
the
yeah.
one trophy that kept me from the platinum, and I'm just never gonna get it because I just could never get her to dish out however many lines she needs to dish out in that game. But I played it I think 3 or 4 times in an attempt to do so. So my Persona 5 Platinum looks down upon Persona 4 Golden, but really only for that. And I think the way I remember describing it was I think the overall cast of characters of Persona 5 a little bit better, but I like your immediate team cast of characters of Persona 4 better. So, but yeah, like both of them are, I think, phenomenal games, and I definitely don't have enough cause to throw a veto out there, especially out as the first game of the list.
The very first game nominated.
Be like, all right, I'm shooting this down, boom. No,
I think that's might just end up being the strongest candidate for not just the Vita, but like to start off this list. Like these are the greatest games of all time within these criteria, and I think
Yep.
it fits.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if nobody wants to shoot it down, we will add Persona 4 Golden on the PlayStation Vita to our list. All right. Up next is me, and I am going to throw out there one of my all-time favorite games, Final Fantasy VI, specifically for the Game Boy Advance.
Ooh.
It obviously came out on the SNES and has been released on any number of other consoles as well. You can find it on the original PlayStation and basically most of the
That's what I thought you
PlayStations at this
nominated
point
it
as through the PSN classics and stuff. But the Game Boy Advance version was kind of the first one they really took some extra polish to it and gave it kind of a bit of a facelift, but not in the Steam version facelift where they changed over a whole bunch of the character sprites and stuff like that and annoyed everybody. But they just kind of retranslated some stuff that I think makes the Game Boy Advance version, in my opinion, the like ultimate way to play it if you can get that version. In large part because the like disc-based versions of the PlayStation have a whole bunch of extra loading times pretty much anytime you go into a fight that I think slows down the game a little bit. So yeah, Game Boy Advance I think is the option I want to go with, and that also still I think trying to play strategically frees up the iconic Super Nintendo system and
Or PS1
the
too.
myriad of other games that you would find on there on that list. But it does take anything else Final Fantasy related off the list. So I wanted to try and get it out there early before somebody tries and pulls this like Final Fantasy VII bullshit or
Somebody's learned from another podcast where they rank video games and saw what happened there.
I'm guessing that's a reference to leaderboard. I've not listened, but it definitely sounds like something that would happen on leaderboard.
SDGC
Okay.
SDGC did their ranking, and FF6 is so far down that list, and you can just feel Mr.
Megative.
Megative,
John.
John.
I gave him
his seed.
I gave him crap for that because it's like number 43 on their list of top 100 games, and I was like, "What the hell, John?" He's like, "I know it wasn't my fault." so yeah, definitely throwing it out there early. But I think I've made my case, so I leave it to you guys if you have any other thoughts or want to bring other Final Fantasies or other Game Boy Advance games into the conversation.
I expected you to come in with a Final Fantasy VI, but I definitely like this Game Boy curveball you kind of added on top of it. I definitely support Final Fantasy VI on being on the list and being marked as one of the greatest of all time. Does anybody have any problems with like losing the Game Boy though, or like the Game Boy Advance?
So it's specifically the Game Boy Advance. Game Boy's still in the running. And then the DS and any of those would still be in the running as well. This would only take out Game Boy Advance games. So your whichever Pokemon's came out on that generation.
It was
Advance
Ruby
Wars.
and Sapphire, and everybody knows they had too much water, so we're fine.
Yeah. Well, but was it those? No, those got dinged for too much water on the DS versions, the remasters. You also had like Fire Red and Leaf Green on the Game Boy Advance.
Those were. Really
I've got my
good.
Game Boy Advance like somewhere over my shoulder, just out
You
of
have the
view.
Golden Sun games for it, like the Mega Man Battle Network games. Geez, we are looking at crossing off a lot of really fantastic games, but.
But in the long run, are those gonna make it on the list, or would we pick other consoles instead?
Yeah, the thing is, as much as like I don't think Final Fantasy VI is the best Final Fantasy game, like I know my choice is like not gonna get like it's not gonna be a dog in the fight. It just isn't.
I mean, you could always veto me, and basically like because the rules are basically, hey, if I get vetoed here, then Final Fantasy still is out in the open, and
yeah, but
Game
none
Boy
of you are
games
gonna
still
let
out
me
in the
put
open.
Final Fantasy VIII on the list. So
I mean, I will definitely say I would veto the shit out of that. That is up there with my least favorites in the series.
yeah, I just don't think like I could make that poll and have it work out. So
I would be tempted to just kick you off the show, actually, if you did that.
The full veto.
Yeah. All right. Well, Cameron had a great first 15 minutes on the show, and thank you next time, Cameron.
yeah, if I would have thought the 5-year-old's temper tantrum coming over through the audio would have been the thing that got me kicked off, but no, it was Final Fantasy VIII.
Yeah. I mean, like, I'll put it out here, like just for the sake of conversation and the fun debate of this, because ultimately, like, I also will fully acknowledge that top ultimate video game list is going to be very facetious by the time we get into like the games like 17, 18, 19, and 20 that get added to the list that are from like the random obscure systems that are still available at that time. Not really like an ultimate game list, but the reason I just have never jived with Final Fantasy VIII, as much as I appreciate everybody that got their remaster recently, is I hate the draw and junction system of that game.
Yep, it is a tough cookie to like swallow on that one.
Yeah, it is. It always comes across to me as like because it's tied to like your stats and stuff. I just never wanted to actually use any magic because I was like, well, if I use these spells, I'm weakening my characters in the long run, so I don't want to. And then also, it takes 30 minutes to try and draw fire from some moth creatures or something if you want to try and get 100 of them out there. So that specific system just like burned that game for me, and I just hate going back to it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I mean, as loath as I am to like let the circle jerk that is the love for Final Fantasy VI like reign supreme, I can't veto it.
But see, I mean, I've not played a Final Fantasy game other than like 30 minutes of 6, and like I feel like the circle jerk isn't really over 6. I feel like the circle jerk is over 7, just from like an outsider's perspective, kind of coming in. I feel like that's gonna people kind
And
of
I think
gush about and
yeah.
like kind of praise more than 6.
And I think that is where you're gonna get like from an outsider's perspective, yes. From the insider's perspective of like longtime Final Fantasy fans, you have the fans who are fans of just Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah. I think that's what I see a lot as well is you have Final Fantasy VII was I think very much easily like the most played of the Final Fantasies because of when it came out and what it did for Final Fantasy, but people who have been like fans of Final Fantasy the series and have played kind of through all of them, the general consensus and the circle jerk that Cameron alludes to does seem to be around Final Fantasy VI. It just as a side plug, I don't know when this episode's going to go live in comparison to the episode of RPG University with our friends at Irrational Passions, but I did an episode of that with Scott over there talking about Final Fantasy VI and further detailing my love for the game in relationship to Final Fantasy and other entries in the series and stuff. So if you want to get more in the weeds on that, that's certainly something that you can check out here somewhere around the time of this going live in the coming weeks around it. But in there, I talked about kind of the like my love of Final Fantasy VI comes very much from when I played it. It was very much like one of the formative games in my life that showed me, oh, like games can tell this like really cool, big, vast story. And I love the characters in the game. It's got I think a great cast. My favorite cast of Final Fantasy characters. And then it also has like a great villain and great music, and the story is basically steampunk Star Wars, where you've got like a band of rebels coming up against an empire and an evil force. And I think I even like played the game before I even saw Star Wars, because Star Wars wasn't like a big thing that my father like passed down on me or anything like that. So like that was my introduction to that kind of hero's journey archetype story. And so like so many of those kinds of reasons fuel why I wanted to get it out there early on the list before somebody else might try and take out my legs from under me.
Yeah, I think the biggest argument for Final Fantasy VI is that in that game you can suplex a train. So
that's true. You can suplex the Phantom Train. It's a killer move. It's way easier. Like I think I even talk about in RPG University. I always do that, and then I just throw a Phoenix down on the train, and that kills it. So it's basically the 1-2 punch that defeats a train. But yeah,
suplex and a Phoenix down. That's what you need.
Yep. And you don't even need the suplex. It's just fun.
Well,
just an added bonus.
I mean, even if you use the Phoenix down and you win in one move, did you really win the fight if you didn't suplex the train?
Very true. Very good point.
Like the moral,
I think it's a great choice.
The moral victory. Yeah, no, I think Final Fantasy VI.
Yeah, you're going to get no objections.
Is going to make it through.
Definitely.
Excellent. I think these are both two great first kind of picks so far.
Excellent. All right. Then, if nobody's going to veto it, we will move on to Logan's selection.
Yeah, I have bounced around so much on like what I want my first pick to be, and I'll have it on the record that I changed it during this recording of what I originally was going to pick to something different. Partially inspired by Trevor, I'm just going to go ahead and do it and like have like the first bit. Like I'm going to pick The Last of Us, and I'm going to do it on the PS3. I think ultimately is what I'm going to say.
Okay.
I mean, it's The Last of Us, right? Like we're all aware of the video game. I think my argument for the PS3 to PS4 is that I think I think a lot of the PS3 generation has been kind of carried over onto the PS4 or Xbox One. And B, I think a lot of the PS3 generation, a lot of its big kind of marquee titles were also available on the Xbox 360. But then more than that, I think The Last of Us is just kind of the marquee game on that system. I think it is the end cap for that system and kind of era for Sony. I mean, obviously, The Last of Us is my favorite game of all time. I think it's a masterpiece. I think it's incredible what it did narratively in terms of building a world and character. I think Joel and Ellie stand so high among kind of video game crafted characters, and really just characters in any medium. I think it's beautiful, poignant, and I think that ultimately is going to be my pick. I think is also like the one where it's like very clearly the broadest system so far. After the Vita and the Game Boy Advance, we're going to like actual systems. It's like it's going to be one that like we're going to lose good games obviously by doing The Last of Us on the PS3. But as much as I love like Infamous 1 or 2 or Uncharted 1, 2, or 3, Uncharted is also available on PS4. And I think this is the game that when I think of the PlayStation 3, this is a game that kind of defines that console for me. It's kind of the culmination of that entire era. So I'm gonna pick The Last of Us on the PS3.
Yeah, no, I think that is again a solid strategy to kind of work from,
Yep.
and it's very interesting. Just obviously, we're recording this like 5-6 months whenever Last of Us 2 just got delayed to, in advance of Last of Us Part 2, which certainly could change the rankings up in future seasons of this show. That might make the list where Last of Us Part 1 gets cut off, or just The Last of Us, I guess. So it's an interesting kind of like seeing it
Time
right
capsule
now
here,
because that is kind of your the only one in that franchise that you need to certainly combat with. But and I agree with your sentiment that there are a lot of PS3 games that we're taking out the running right now, but like any of the ones that were on my list, I could still argue for them on Xbox 360 or something like that.
Exactly.
Because of the I definitely echo of the PS3 exclusives to like the first party studios, Last of Us certainly for me stands out above everything else as well. So no argument from me. How about anybody else?
I definitely agree with a lot of like what both of you have said, especially with I thought about like the PS3 console, and I was really trying to think about like what are those exclusives that were really great on there, like in like a lot of the ones you mentioned, like Infamous, and I was even thought about like Killzone, and of course like Uncharted, which are just like fantastic. But I definitely agree that like The Last of Us is like a standout and like an end cap for that like generation. And it also has like definitely one of the best intros to any video game ever, just like super powerful.
And I think part of like the thing for The Last of Us 2 is like the question I get asked a lot is like, what is your favorite season in that game? And I'm always like, I could literally pick 3 of these 4 seasons. Like it changes daily. Like I think the game just builds so well, to where each season is so distinct and is such its own kind of powerful statement. To where it is like, the opening of the game is incredible, but also like so is all the stuff with like him and like Tess, or so is all the stuff in like Fall is an incredible season that I love, and then it's like Winter and you have the stuff with David, and like you get to kind of the final emotional arc of what Spring is, and it's like every one of the seasons of the game is so distinct and like is its own game almost in its own right. Like I think it just builds so beautifully and so poetically, that like you get to the end, and I think because again it's that thing like the ending I think is also super well done and super kind of understated in the final scenes, and it's just a rad video game. You know what I mean, guys? It's a rad game.
So
Cameron, what do you think?
I'm not going to veto it, but I will say I'm not going to let it go onto the list unmarred. There are several points in that game that are...
Oh, we're going to do this? Okay.
Yeah, we're going to do this. There are several points in that game that, systems-wise, are straight up gabagoo.
Should we, I guess at this point in time too, Trevor, because we never said it, Spoiler alert, right? We should clarify that. Like, we're definitely gonna spoilers probably.
Oh yeah.
I'm not gonna mention anything about
Okay.
story wise or content
I'm
wise.
not, but like I just
Yep.
at some point I feel like we will when we get to like rank and stuff
Yeah,
later on.
probably.
Yeah.
That might be a thing.
I will say, as like the narrative goes, like I know people to think about The Last of Us, and I will say this in its benefit. It is a game that I don't know anybody who played it who didn't like it. At least, let me also put this out there. I don't think I know anybody who didn't love it. It really is a critic, like it is a total darling on every spectrum. But between its crafting system, some of its stealth portions, the bridge. I'm not going to go into any more details about the bridge, but the bridge, that should bring back the recollections of that for everybody, and the PTSD that I'm sure I'm not the only person that has from that bridge section. Essentially, yeah. So, but to the point, I would make that even though this is a phenomenal game and definitely belongs on this list, I don't think any game should go on here unmarred or like not looked at as like with the other games we could, like we mentioned, Persona 4, Golden, incredible game, but it's hard to like the conflict between Persona 5 and how Persona 5 kind of one-ups everything that Golden does, but Golden has just such a special feeling to it. When you talk about Final Fantasy VI, like Final Fantasy VI is
one of 15 Final Fantasy games for starters.
Yeah, just mainline. But you have Final Fantasy VI being what it is, but doesn't mean that it's not necessarily universally loved. It's not the most popular Final Fantasy game by any means, but it's also it is a testament to long-term storytelling in a game during an era that didn't really do that a lot. So I also think that The Last of Us, it's the contrarian in me that like pops up every once in a while when people bring up The Last of Us and all they do is praise it and nobody talks about like how stupid it is that in the middle of a fight, like my metal scissors break.
I mean, like there are elements where it's like, yeah, I give those things a pass as part of like just keeping it from like being okay. Yeah, you've got scissors, so now you can just stab everything. Like I appreciate that it sets the rules of hey, you have 2 or 3 uses of this thing, easily identified, so that you're not super overpowered and you do feel.
But then they break it when they introduce Ellie's knife.
But like Ellie's knife also isn't like
I murdered 3 dozen zombies with Ellie's knife alone because her knife auto kills, and it goes into a sequence where you clip out and you can't be attacked. So like there are certain things about this game that I think, and this is part of the problem. Those are such small things. But when you are talking about like a literal masterpiece, these small things are like blemishes on it. And so I don't think any game should go on here unmarred. That's for sure.
Sure, I don't even think this is a mar, and I think just as talking critically of these games. I mean, I think that I don't agree with some of the points. Obviously, in particular, I think I love the crafting system in The Last of Us. I really do. It's like there are a lot of bad crafting systems in video games. There are arguably more bad ones than there are good ones. And I think that The Last of Us is one that does it very well. I like the fact that I think it's both that good balance of easy to understand and quick to use, while also still having kind of hard decisions to be made and kind of complexities to it, but not in an overwhelming sense, right? Like it's a good middle ground, I view for myself at least. I think that like a thing I could talk about is that like I think the gameplay of The Last of Us is something that is like really actually underappreciated about that game. I love the gameplay of The Last of Us, and I think that like for obvious reasons it takes kind of a backseat to the narrative and the kind of the characters of that story, but I think The Last of Us is incredibly fun to play. Like I think it is one of the most like just tension filled gameplay experiences I have playing that game over like the 20 hours. Like I think I'm just constantly looking behind my shoulder and constantly just kind of shoulders hunched together. Like it's a game that just makes you feel tense. And I think that comes in the gameplay itself, right? Like I think it isn't as novel or crazy now, but it's because a lot of games have done it. But like grabbing onto a human and have them like claw at your like arm is a really cool like small gameplay touch that I think carries a lot of kind of emotion, and extra kind of depth to that world and what it is, and to these being people to it. I think the fact that the clickers and the humans react differently and handle situations differently, and you have to kind of combat them, and overcome them differently is really cool. I think the fact that like if you're like me, you just try to avoid interacting with the clickers because they're so strong, they're so like overpowered, they're so kind of wily, and that I almost prefer a human fight is a really cool gameplay touch. I think how the game kind of evolves its systems and mechanics as Ellie and Joel evolve throughout the course of the game is a really, really smart move that just kind of happens in the background. Like, The Last of Us is a video game, so there are video game elements to it, but I think something that I find that I've always found really beautiful with The Last of Us is that, like, the video game elements and moments are ones that I don't even think about. They're just kind of embedded into what that game is set very quickly. You just kind of accept them, and it doesn't take you out of the experience anymore. And I think that we talk a lot about living, breathing worlds in video games, kind of, and like these immersive experiences. And I think that I've played very few video games where I'm as immersed into that world as The Last of Us, right? Just like walking through Boston or walking through like this dilapidated, abandoned, fallen apart hotel in Pittsburgh, or walking through like the mountains and the forests of Colorado. Like the game just very, I think, evocatively puts you in these locations and in these places. And like I like the image of getting to the campus during the fall section and like crossing like kind of the giant like stone archways and having like just golden sunlight flood the entire campus is like seared into my brain. Like it's a beautiful video game graphically. I think it's a beautiful video game narratively, and I think that it is a great marriage of this world and these characters and this story with gameplay that I personally don't think hinders it, and in fact I think accentuates the best aspects of that kind of world of these characters. And again, like it's way more commonplace now, but having Ellie just be there to kind of crack jokes and tell a story and just kind of fill out more of the shades of this world with her dialogue options was really cool, and like I think sort of unique at the time, and how like seamless it was and how flawless it was and how it didn't feel really forced. And so I think it's, I mean, obviously again, it's my favorite game of all time. I can talk about The Last of Us, but I do think that it is also a special game, and I think especially in this first round where we've all kind of picked giant games in a lot of ways that I think are these kind of beacons of what video games at their best can be, in Persona 4 Golden, in Final Fantasy 6, with The Last of Us, hopefully with whatever Cam picks too. Like, I think it very much stands along those two games. So that'd be my final statement.
Excellent. One question I want to put out to the panel is, obviously we're speaking pre any kind of Last of Us Part 2, but do you think there's a chance that a year from now, if we had put this list together, that based on what we've seen of Last of Us Part 2, it would take that, or do you think Last of Us Part 1 would be like, no, that's the one that would probably still be on the list?
I'd say 1 is definitely the one that's going to still be on the list. Like, I think the gameplay stuff that, from what people have talked about, has been super cool. I love hearing about and reading about the improvements they've made to the actual gameplay system. I'm really excited to see like and experience like that much of a more better built game and engine as far as like what you do in that game. But I will say that I don't, with the cultural touchstone that The Last of Us is, I don't think Part 2 is going to, like, that's just, it's, the shoes are too big to fill, and we don't, without playing it, I can't say for sure, but I lean towards no.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. Like, I can definitely see a situation where it is The Godfather Part 1 versus Part 2 kind of thing, where there are people who think that Part 2 is the better kind of film and is the better experience. I think, for me personally, part of it is what Cam said. I think that The Last of Us came out first, and I think The Last of Us Part 2 is going to be huge. Like, I think that video game is going to be massive. It's going to be a huge success, critically, commercially, everything. But I also think that there are these moments in time where just, like, the kind of the year and this kind of era is defined by a title. And I think it's whether it's film or video games or anything, I think that is the case. And I think The Last of Us very much is like kind of helps define an era in video games and storytelling. And I think that The Last of Us Part 2 could conceivably be a better video game, but I don't know if it'll have that same kind of cultural impact in the same way that Part 1 did, like Cam said. And also, it's just, it's really, really, really hard to match it. The bar is set arguably impossibly high, right? Like, that's kind of the thing, too, where it's like, because if the game is as good as The Last of Us, people are like, cool, that's what I expected it to be. I expect it to be like The Last of Us, right? And if it's a little bit worse than The Last of Us Part 1, it's like, it's not as good as the first one, right? Like, it has to exceed, like, this almost incredible bar where it's like, The Last of Us got, what, like, 250, like, perfect score kind of things? Like, I don't think we're going to see that again for Part 2. Like, I think people always call The Last of Us Part 1, like, kind of the godfather moment for video games, right? Where, like, games hit this kind of moment of, like, mature storytelling and kind of characters.
Wait, who says that besides just you, Logan?
No, I did not invent that at all.
Oh, really? Okay, I thought
like, a lot of people call The Last of Us like the Citizen Kane or like the godfather of video games, and it's like I think that
I've never heard that before. So
I've definitely heard the Citizen Kane of video game kind of thing, but that's because I feel like that gets used more as like the monolith in film for like, that's like the pinnacle.
Yeah, and I think that unlike in films, The Last of Us actually is a pinnacle, and. Citizen Kane's not. It's not that great. Watch it again. But look. No, Citizen Kane is great. Like Citizen Kane is very. It's that argument of like it's super important. That doesn't mean it's good anymore. It's that thing.
Okay.
It's very important. Yeah, it's very revolutionary. I'm not necessarily great still, but like I think Trevor's point. Yeah, like I think there will definitely be a cohort of people who like Part 2 more than Part 1. Some of us on this panel very easily could be that, but like I think one thing The Last of Us Part 2 has going against it is that. I think there was kind of a sentiment of like, do we even need this game? Right? Like I love The Last of Us. It is my favorite video game. It's one of my favorite stories ever. And I was on the record of being like, I don't want a sequel. Like I don't think we need a sequel to this. And so it's like, it's just, it'll be interesting to see the reaction when it comes out. It's hard to gauge, right? We haven't played any of the game yet. I think how it balances what The Last of Us was about versus what Part 2 kind of seems to be about. And kind of the opposite ends of the emotional spectrum they seem to be on is very interesting to me. But yeah, like, I definitely think there's a scenario where like it can be better than the first one, and I'd welcome that. I'd be excited about that. But I think the majority of people will probably ultimately still have one over two. Like I feel like it'd ultimately kind of be like a Uncharted 2 versus 3 moment, where like even though like I'm in the minority and think 3 is a better game, I think for a lot of people 2 was a game where it's like this is what this series is, and so even if like games come along that maybe tweak that or improve it in some ways, 2 is always the game for them.
Sure, but how cool would it be if it's instead of an Uncharted 2 versus Uncharted 3 moment, it's an Uncharted 1 versus Uncharted 2 is the better analog, and Last of Us 2 really does end up somehow stepping up the game that much.
I would love that. It'd be amazing, right? Like it'd be super super cool to see that. I think even more so because unlike an Uncharted, like I really do think that Last of Us Part 2 is the end of that series. Like I don't think there's going to be a Part 3 or anything. And so it would be cool if kind of the conclusion of that is such a marked jump up from where Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 2 was. And like again, like Naughty Dog definitely has it in them, right? Like the last bad video game they made was Crash Bandicoot. So like it's been 20 years of like just ever increasingly like talented and diverse and interesting and thoughtful video game. So yeah, I'm very excited to see what they do with it.
Cool. Any thoughts to add, Frank?
The only other thing I would just want to briefly mention, if we're talking about The Last of Us 2, is it's definitely all about the single player, but I also kind of enjoyed the multiplayer that was on there too.
No, I do not want to talk about this.
The multiplayer in Last of Us is great.
I think it was really fun. Like, I didn't get as deep into it as it was kind of built for, but it was actually really deep, and, like, they put a lot of thought into that, and kind of, like, the factions and all, like, trying to get food and kind of, like, stay on top of all that stuff was, like, I thought it was really interesting especially because, like, I don't really love multiplayer for a lot of games, but I definitely thought it was interesting.
Same, and I think, at the very least, it's the most... it seems like Naughty Dog ever put kind of like love and attention into the multiplayer, right? Because like Uncharted multiplayer was like always fun, but it like wasn't super deep, and it was just kind of like, all right, this is good, but like not like blow my mind or anything, but like Uncharted. I mean, The Last of Us, it felt like they actually put a lot of thought into what that multiplayer should be for what the game was, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. The only things I would add, kind of going off of the conversation, would be I actually like from a mechanical standpoint, I think Last of Us 2 is going to be leaps and bounds above, and I think it's going to solve a lot of the nitpicking kind of issues that Cameron addressed with. I think crafting is probably going to be improved and all that stuff. And
From what I've heard and what I've read, it has been. So
yeah.
I'm excited.
And one of the things that I think they did with Left Behind that was one of the most exciting aspects for me of the potential of the future was they figured out how to make the human AI opponents interact with the clicker AI, and so in Left Behind you could like pit the two of those factions together, whereas in the original you're fighting humans or you're fighting clickers, never the twain shall meet. And so I look forward to kind of having those scenarios in Last of Us Part Two, which I think just for the tension of that kind of game, just like amps up the stuff, and it really will come down to me probably. What is that story like? What are the characters like in this one compared to the first game? Because yeah, the first game is completely self-contained story, but I've always argued that just because the first game is such a great self-contained story doesn't mean that more stories in that universe can't be as good or better. I
Absolutely,
remember
And as they say, where there's money, there is a way.
that is true. I remember way back in the day, back when Barrett Courtney, our friend over at Kind of Funny, still had his Bayazona Gamers. He wrote a whole thing about how he thought Last of Us should never have a sequel. And I challenged back then even that idea of like a proposed sequel for me would have been like I really would love to see what happens if Ellie finds out that all the stuff that Joel does at the end of that game, and I would love to see the tension that causes between those two characters played out. So that kind of dynamic alone would be worth another round of playing around with those characters. And then yeah, just in the grand scheme of things, the technological leaps and bounds that I think all of the Sony studios have made in the last generation basically have given me a lot of great hope for what the next installment has. So I could very much see part two coming up on this list, or on these lists in the future. So cool. Well, it sounds like we're all good with that game appearing on the list,
boom.
which brings us to our fourth and final pick of round one here.
The one I'm the most nervous
That's
about.
like, yeah, I definitely was thinking about that earlier when Cameron got like just randomly picked as the fourth choice. I was like, oh god, that's right. I kind of fear that Cam's going to be like the troll of this list,
Yeah.
and so what's that actually going to take shape as? So hit us, Cam. What's your pick for round one?
I'm joking. That's a pre-recorded joke, or before we start recording. I have a lot of games that I could pick from. I have a lot that I could talk about, but I think if we're going to be talking about this list, and we're talking about impact of games, and not just like, oh, because they're our favorites, but because of like the merit that they have, I think I need to. I'm gonna go away from what I thought I was gonna do, and I'm gonna select. Do I do this or do I not? Sorry, I'm now regretting making this decision to make a different decision. BioShock, BioShock for the Xbox 360.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely.
So
Sorry, I saw Frank's nod, and Frank was like doing like the what's his name? The Chinatown, The Shining,
Jack
Jack
Nicholson.
Jack Nicholson, thank you.
okay.
Jack Nicholson. He did like the Jack Nicholson restaurant nod from
I have that.
like he straight up did that.
I have that written down on mine. Like I had two for the 360 that I've been like debating between, but that was definitely one of them.
I also had BioShock written down.
So it's not on any of my pre-existing list right now, but that only has a handful of games on it. In part because I did have other games of the PS3 or Xbox 360 era, because with Logan taking out PS3 and now Cameron potentially taking out Xbox 360, you lose pretty much most of the third-party stuff
Generation.
from that generation.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Because
We could always select the Wii version.
Unless-
I was gonna say, like,
unless it
all right,
got-
who's fighting for Mass Effect 3 on the Wii or whatever? Because did Mass Effect 2 ever come to the Wii?
No, it was
Like-
only the third one, I think, just on
Right,
Wii
yeah.
U.
So yeah, like that, like we're very much in like, oh yeah, this takes a lot of the 1-2 punch here of Logan and Cam takes almost most of a generation out of the running.
I
So-
know, like
No,
that's why I was
again-
hesitating.
Yeah,
'cause
no,
I'm like,
but I get it, and
Yeah.
I get it for a selection like BioShock.
Yeah, this is my like kind of two-pronged statement in defense of Cam is that like I think a lot of the bigger games still got kind of re-rezzed up, remastered for like PS4, Xbox One. Like Arkham, the Arkham games could still be picked for like PS4. Like if that's a big one for you, but all and like Call of Duty games, like just kind of were on like consoles for forever. But also, I think, I mean, again, at least for me personally, like I think for two games like The Last of Us and BioShock to be kind of the two representatives of that era for these consoles, it's like that seems kind of about right actually. And I enjoy it being the person I am because it's like a full circle thing. It's like the very beginning of that era and then the very end of that era with BioShock to The Last of Us, and like how storytelling in games grew and evolved, and like these two games are kind of pillars of narrative games. BioShock's a great video game. And I can also say definitively now, after having played it for Video Game Book Club, BioShock 2 is not better than BioShock 1, as some people might have led you to think. It's not.
It's not at all. But to defend my point, my experience with BioShock is, so I missed the initial launch of the 360 PS3 era.
Same.
I just I wasn't working. I was a teenager.
PS3s
and
were
my
$600.
Yeah, PS3s were $600.
Yeah, also that.
And then I ended up working at my family's restaurant and making friends with my former co-host over at KGN, Chandler. And he told me, he's like, you got to pick up BioShock, and you have to pick up a 360, pick up BioShock. He's like, you'll be good starting from there. And like Logan said, like these are the bookends of that generation, BioShock and The Last of Us. And while BioShock may not have been an exclusive, being on the 360 and being my first introduction to quote-unquote next gen back then was mind-blowing, because I was making the jump from PS2 to 360 with the level of storytelling, the level design alone in that game is phenomenal. But the idea that it took a highbrow concept, like the overwhelming, like just brick of text that is Ayn Rand's philosophy and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and turns it and says, okay, you want to see what a real, like, you want to see a society that is built like this, like the quote-unquote like libertarian ideal looks like? Here it is. And the way that it's developed from there, the way that it rolls out from there on just like a conceptual level to when you start that game, the plane you're on crashes and you're saved by finding this lighthouse, and you go down and you're introduced to this projection show that is still arguably like some of the best like narrative storytelling. Like this tells you everything you need to know about this place you're going to, and it builds it up as a utopia. Then you get your first scene and your first look at it, and it's just gone to hell. And it's so good in those moments, those early moments against the first splicer.
Yeah, with the wrench. Yeah,
Was one of the first times I played a video game where I legitimately felt afraid.
Yeah,
and when I played that game, that changed how I played that game throughout the rest of it. Where I played conservatively, I did not go running out. I hid. I would hide in a corner for like 10, 15 minutes waiting for them to like walk by, and then wait for them to walk by again so I knew their patterns so I could avoid them. And it drove me to find out a way to like hide myself better. And that's when I figured out about camouflage. And the way that I played that game that first time was so impactful. And then playing it again the second time and feeling a completely different experience was just it really is a generation defining game.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was one of the first games of that generation, I think says a lot. Like, if you really look at The Last of Us and BioShock as like the bookends, the end and the beginning of that generation, you understand and comprehend that this is why this is one of the most important generations, not just in video games, but in storytelling and not proving so much as giving the credence and evidence to show that yes, video games are art.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, everything Cam said I agree with. And like, it's also that thing of, a lot of times you can be like, how do these moments play out like after the fact, right? And there's an amazing IGN feature that Tom Marks did where he somehow had managed to like never get like the big twist from BioShock spoiled for him.
Oh my gosh.
And then he went back and like played the game finally for the first time after like a decade, and it's him getting like detailing basically like his kind of thought process as he played it, and like getting to that moment being like it's like him just being like it's still amazing, like it's still one of the greatest like twists. It works so well. Like, I'll never forget because like I played this game. I waited a few years after it had come out, and I played it on the PS3. But it was so that like that jump from the PS2 to the PS3 and getting to that moment was a moment of me just being utterly rocked, right? Like, it is just everything you thought the game was just being like flipped on a dime, and it's so clever. It's so smart too, right? Like, a lot of times video game twist endings can feel cheap. Look at BioShock Infinite, and this is one to me that felt so earned and so effective and so powerful. Because when we talk about it still, God, what, 12 years after the game's come out, like BioShock is just a really smart game. It is a really clever game, and it is both that because of like the Andrew Ryan collectivism, like libertarian fever dream aspects of it, but also because every one of the areas in the game you go in and every one of the kind of level tiered bosses you encounter are each great and wonderful in their own rights, right? And like Sander Cohen, I truly believe is one of the best characters ever written in a video game. Like, he's such a, like, in terms of side characters, he's such a great side character in that video game. And like, there's a lot of really cool Sander Cohen writing that like I would love to like link in this episode if we remember, which so we won't. But like, he's so good and he's so creepy and unnerving, and like his whole just like his final dance and everything about that character and that world. Like,
imagine
and then,
if
like,
if you put John Waters and Andy Warhol and you slammed them into the same
That's
person.
exactly what it is. And and like it shouldn't work, and it works so well, right? And like the crazy, like bloodthirsty, like everything has to be perfect doctor in that first area.
Oh yeah,
is still some of the like the scariest moments I've ever had playing a video game. It is absolutely terrifying, especially because you're still just figuring out what Rapture is. You have this crazy, like deranged doctor chasing after you and like just kind of hurtling towards, and that game carries such a great sense of pace into it. And like, obviously we could critique it and say that like the final act isn't as good as like everything before it, but I don't hate the final act. I think it's definitely the weakest part, but it's still strong. And B, I like the actual ending itself. Presumably you get the good ending, but like that game is just, it was one of those moments for me where it's like, this is what video games can be. Like, I'll never forget playing BioShock first time being like, this is what video games can be. Like, it was such a sharp departure from what I'd played before on like the PS2.
And I think the final point of my argument is going to be this: a man chooses, a slave obeys. Like, that scene is encompassing of the entire like ideology of Andrew Ryan and this game. And oh man, there's so much about this game that is so incredible and so impactful that I really like. The moment I really started actually thinking about this, because it's on my list, but when I really put in the effort to think about, well, which game am I actually going to put up with Final Fantasy VI, Persona 4 Golden, The Last of Us, like how can I put out what game is worthy of standing up there with these juggernaut amazing games? And BioShock is it.
I think, yeah, to that point, like, I love the fact that, like, this would be the final pick for the first episode, where it's like, these are just games that are kind of, that are, like, titans of the industry, right? Where it is, yeah, Persona 4 to Final Fantasy 6 to The Last of Us, and then Bioshock, like these are like these are games that I very much could also see being all games in the top 10 final ranking as well. But B, like these are just great video games, and like I'll just say this, Frank, would you kindly give your reasonings on what you thoughts on Bioshock are? Would you just continue?
Yeah. Like I definitely agree with everything that y'all have said so far, and I definitely, of course, like I think that was a generation-defining game, and especially like you remarked too, like so early on. And I definitely remember too, like what's that? The intros also in Bioshock also I think is one of just the strongest in gaming too.
Absolutely.
And I remember at the time, like when we were talking about kind of being so early into next gen, like it was so beautiful graphically, and it even still kind of holds up to today. And I remember like still thinking that kind of when you're floating in the water there, just kind of waiting for a while because I thought it was just like a cutscene that was just going to keep going. But you actually just that's just gameplay. Like you just have to keep going through and kind of like swim over to the lighthouse. And I just definitely love that game all the way through, from all the villains and all the bad guys and all the side quests you can kind of just stumble into. And I also, personally, I don't know about you guys, but I definitely love the gameplay of Bioshock as well. Like, I think it's so,
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I think it's so fun. Like, I just think it's so, like, I love upgrading the weapons and finding those different machines and getting the better, like, I love the shotgun and the crossbow. Like, I remember these weapons still, and like getting the different upgrades for them, and like just kind of getting more. The way I played it was kind of, I guess, a little bit more like battle focused, like fighting everything, but I definitely found a lot of enjoyment in that.
I hid until somebody came in front of me, that I would freeze them and then shoot their head off with electric buttons.
Yeah, that freeze power plasmid is like it's so good. Like,
but then again, is there anything better than launching bees at somebody's face?
Oh, the bees.
Like,
and that's the thing too, like we didn't even talk about, like the plasma system is so great too, right? And like the gameplay is amazing in this game, right? And like strategizing and like how you take it a Big Daddy, right? Because those Big Daddy fights, I still have like nightmares about to like today. Like they are so tense and so terrifying. And, like,
oh
my god, it's incredible.
And you're like,
I'll never forget
dead.
that moment.
And it's like, no,
never forget
keep
it.
fighting. Oh my gosh,
like it's so good. And like I think one of the cool things that Bioshock does that as the series progresses, it kind of loses is. The first Bioshock game is a survival horror game in a lot of ways. Like, it just is that game. Like, it is not really a first-person shooter at all. And by Bioshock Infinite is a first-person shooter that, like, has, like, no real horror elements to it. Like, has no real kind of, like, scary elements to it. And, like, that first one is so unnerving, is so tense, and is so scary. And, like, the gameplay works in that way. And, like, I always felt underpowered in Bioshock, even at the end of that game. Like, it just makes you feel like you were just like a tiny little speck on this like larger world of Rapture. To say nothing of the fact that like Rapture itself is incredible. Like that is still like kind of the gold standard in a lot of ways of like a video game world and a location. There's just so much that works in that game that that's honestly shocking for how early that game came into the generation, that I just like all kind of clicked together.
For me, I think I'm probably the lightest on BioShock of this group. And I played it. I was looking at my PSN profiles while you guys were talking. I played through all three of them back in like February and March of this year. Just because I was looking for stuff to play at the beginning of the year and was like, hey, I think it was around the time that you guys had done the video game book club over at IP and stuff, and so I was like,
probably.
I have the remastered collection. Let me go back and see how those games hold up. And for me, probably largely because I've never been too acutely into the survival horror genre. While I appreciate the story of one, the gameplay of one is a lot lacking for me, and it's not even in the sense of like feeling underpowered like you kind of described, Logan, because I'm thinking back, I'm like, I feel like I always had money, like I always had like a full wallet that I could take to any of the vending machines and buy full ammunition if I needed going into any fight, playing on like normal mode. Largely because I scrounge and look through like every purse and every trash can and stuff in those games. But for me, the gameplay as it continues on, and they instead of in that first game you can only have a weapon or a plasmid at a time, and they do kind of go more the shooter route with it, and like, okay, in Bioshock 2 you can have your weapon and your plasmids both active at the same time, and continuing that on to Infinite. I prefer that kind of development of the game, but I will also say that The story of Bioshock certainly um, uh, s- still stands the test of time, kind of thing.
Hmm.
I I I like Bioshock Infinite's story. Uh, on par with that. But like the thing with
Oh,
Bioshock Infinite for me is always I'm more curious as to like all the things that got lost in the cutting room floor when you like
Yeah,
watch
yeah.
definitely.
the trailers of Infinite over the years and see like, oh, they clearly had other ideas that they were playing around with before this final version. Um, and so I'm not I like I don't I don't fault Bioshock as the choice of the franchise. And so the thing I am left with, especially because I'm realizing I could strategically be a super dick about this and veto it because in round two, because of how the voting works, I'll have the first pick next round, and so I could basically be like, all right, I'm gonna veto Bioshock so I can get my 360 pick in there. But I also am gonna I'm not gonna veto it, so I'll like put your mind at ease right now. Um,
Okay.
but but a main factor of that is I never had a 360, so I feel that that would be disingenuous to veto it for one of the other games that I would have picked. And I mean, I'll throw it out there, like because Mass Effect 2 was basically like the pick that I had on my list,
Oh gosh,
and
that's oh.
and so it's
Oof.
like, so I'm sitting here thinking like, do I veto Bioshock 2 so that I can propose Mass Effect 2, or do I veto Bioshock so I can put Mass Effect 2 on the list next week as its replacement? Because I don't, while it did, it's also out on PC and I can fight for it there. I think there are a wide plethora of other PC things that maybe outrank Mass Effect. So Mass Effect 2, like that's a game that I imagine we're probably cutting from the list by putting BioShock out there, and that like that's certainly a game I have much more love for and affinity for than BioShock. But I also very much appreciate kind of the points that you guys have raised of given BioShock and when it came out and kind of it certainly is an incredibly iconic game, and I have like
Hmm.
all of the images that you guys are highlighting stand and burned in my brain as well, and that
Yeah.
that the first time you encounter that splicer over the crib kind of thing where you
Yep.
get that
Oh
gun
yeah.
right out the gate, like that's certainly another iconic image that's boiled in there. And the to your earlier point in the podcast, Cameron, of like games um, should be games being marred or whatever. Like the big thing I would say that I hate about this game is the ending, the third act that you were kind of talking about, Logan. Pretty much anything
Hmm.
after the twist for me is either forgettable or bad,
Yeah.
and that's
It's fair.
like, and that's having played it 9 months ago or whatever. Um, so it should be like the end of that game should be fresher in my mind than it is. And really, like for me, that game very much ends at the twist, which is a phenomenal twist in gaming. And it's one of I don't. I feel like I probably experienced it unspoiled back when I first played it on the PS3 in whenever 2009 or 10 or whatever. But it it is a great twist and it's great storytelling, and it makes me like miss that we haven't gotten more in the BioShock universe, because I did like
Yeah.
I do think it I didn't I thought BioShock 2 is a step down, as I think is the kind of the common thing, but then I really enjoyed BioShock Infinite and the idea of where those like how you can keep telling different versions of that story with the different twists and stuff. I think I pitched to I think one of you guys at some point like my idea
It was me.
was it Logan
I know exactly what it is.
was
Yeah.
like
Yep.
my idea for a BioShock 3 would be or next BioShock or whatever, I guess because it'd be 4 or whatever, would be like a lunar station that has like lunar station lighthouse or something like that that you go and find, and it goes full circle then into like System Shock, and you get basically back into that abandoned space station vibe and feel. And I think there's a lot of fun that could be told in that kind of environment. So I would still love to see something like that, and maybe that's what the unannounced Bioshock that's out there supposedly being worked on in Texas is. But we'll see. But yeah, not I don't have enough cause to veto the game, so it lives to make it onto the list. But yeah, I am sad for all of the potential that we lose by losing kind of that generation at this point, because I think there are a ton of options still sitting out there in that generation that I think largely this comes from the fact that looking at this panel, I don't think any of us are really crazy Xbox 360 people. So I don't think we would have fought for anything like super Xbox 360 from that generation outside of the multi-platform stuff like this.
You know what? I do regret it because I just remembered Sneak King is an exclusive on 360.
God damn it.
Yep. Yeah, that'll have to make its appearance on somebody else's season.
Logan.
I do want to piggyback a little bit off of what you were saying too, because I also have Mass Effect 2 written down for the 360. That was the other one I was kind of bouncing back and forth between, and I honestly even think, like you said too, personally, I think that might be my more favorite, or like the one that I had a lot more of enjoyment with, and I attached to those characters a lot more. But I really think BioShock is like that, really, just when we're talking about like the masterpieces in gaming that are like kind of really standouts.
Mm-hmm.
I think BioShock really fits like right in there with that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've never even played Mass Effect. So that's like that's part of it for me, which is like that'd have been when if you'd made that pitch to like Sway, have been like, I just haven't played this game. Like I just can't speak, not even intelligent, just like at all to it. I know that it's better than than Mass Effect 1. That's about it. And then otherwise it's like, I don't know, I have nothing really beyond that. And like, I think that, again, like the PS3 360 generation is like a great generation. And I feel like all four of us collectively are like biased in the fact that I think like we all kind of not necessarily grew up, but like maybe grew up in terms of like our involvement in games and like how into games we like got in that point in time. And like, I'm sure we all kind of got into like the games like journalism side of things at that point too, in terms of just like that's where we probably all collectively discovered like Greg and like IGN, like Beyond, the Game Scoop, like the Kind of Funny crew, like all probably started there. And so like we have us like I know I do at least like have a soft spot in my heart for that generation, for that era of games. But like ultimately I think that having that kind of era and moment in time in my life be represented by two games like BioShock and The Last of Us, I think I at least can sit and be like, I think that is a good representation of what this generation was capable of the heights it could achieve, of the potential it had in it, from the very beginning with BioShock to kind of the very, very end with The Last of Us. And also I think it gives us a great top four game, like opening four games where we all can see just how much of like a kind of an instant classic, kind of a mash piece, or to kind of say Frank's phrase there. I think it's a great opening four games.
And I will also say that like something like Mass Effect isn't completely out the running, largely because of Xbox One's backward compatibility. Like it could still be argued as the Xbox One game, and that falls within.
I can make that argument because like
the realm.
What is the Xbox One really?
Rise.
Yeah. I mean, I've got like Sunset Overdrive is my hands down favorite Xbox One game right now.
Fair.
But also
That's fair.
like
that's a good call.
When it comes down to Sunset Overdrive versus Mass Effect, I'm not necessarily gonna make that call right off the bat. So,
that's a good.
But yeah, I agree. I think this is a good, solid start to this list. I'm very excited to see where we go from here.
Week 2 is going to be very much more eclectic, I feel like. This is like open 4 is like, these are some of the greatest legitimate games, like everybody pretty much agrees on of all time. And week 2 is going to be like, all right, let's talk about the Master System, kids. Let's get into it now.
All right, so there we have it. Week 1, our selections are Persona 4 Golden on the PlayStation Vita, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 6 on the Game Boy Advance, not 7. Although 7 Remake is also looking very, very good. The Last of Us on PlayStation 3 and the original BioShock for our Xbox 360 game. So yeah, we will.
Good list.
We will be back next week to kind of add our next 4 potential picks. And as I alluded to a little bit ago, the order rotates every week. So next week it'll go me, Logan, Cam, and Frank, because he had the first pick this week, moves to the bottom of the list next week. So yeah, I think that's going to be some fun. I look forward to seeing where we go from here. And this is always like when I envision the idea for this show, these are the kinds of things I really enjoy. Is that like yeah, week one it's going to be a bit of a it has the potential to be a bloodbath for like the let's get all of the big games out right out the gate, and then weeks 2 and 3 are going to be like, all right, now we got to like figure out what like that next tier of stuff is, and then weeks 4 and 5 and potentially beyond are like, all right, yeah, let's find what random Genesis game we want to pull onto this list because that's what we're.
Oh, I already.
Those are our options moving forward. So I look forward. Thank you guys for joining me for this pilot episode of that Ultimate Video Game List show. You can follow Logan at Lefty Logie.
That is me.
Logan, since this is also going to be kind of coinciding with the launch of that nerdy site that we're going out with, anything in particular with that you wanna pitch or plug, or just anything in general?
I mean, check out that nerdy site. It's a cool little place. A great collective of people doing great things. It's going to build a really awesome platform of content, video written, audio, everything. I think that this show in particular is going to be one you want to keep an eye out. So please, again, like Trevor said, like it, subscribe to it, give it the stars, all the things. But also, that Wannabe Film Club is a really cool film podcast that we're doing alongside Ben Bellevue and Chloe, who are also part of that nerdy site. I think that I have to get it. That nerdy site podcast.
Maybe right now I think I've got it set as that nerdy site show.
That nerdy site show. It's kind of like just like flagship, just like all of us kind of hanging out, talking, just kind of whatever is gonna be one that's gonna be a blast, and that I'm really excited about. But also just like the written side of things, what we'll do there, video stuff, and also just like the fact that we're gonna stream for like 30 hours every 3 days. Before you will hear this, as you're listening to this, some point in time in the future, in the past, whenever you're listening to this. And that's going to be a lot of dumb fun that we have a lot of cool ideas for. So just keep track of all that unless it's already happened and you're in the future, in which case I hope you enjoyed it. Was it good? Did you like it? Have you subscribed yet? I hope so.
Excellent. You can follow Cameron at Unsexiest Comedy. Anything you want to promote or plug, Cam? Because you're also still doing stuff with Handsome Phantom. I didn't mention that at the beginning.
I am, yeah. Actually, this would be an important thing to note. By the time this launches, I won't be at Unsexiest Comedy anymore.
Oh, okay.
An announcement.
I'll go ahead and change that on stuff. So what are you gonna? what are you changing things to?
Tentatively, I think it's at Rev Cabot, at Rev C Abbott. That's pretty much what I think I settled on. There's a lot of big announcements for me coming up. I turn 30 November 1st, and I'll be putting out a big announcement about updates to my quote-unquote brand.
Excellent.
As it stands.
I see. I just got all that stuff out of the way a few months ago, so... But you're still beating me by a few years, so good on you. All right, so potentially Rev Cabot, wherever you can follow Cam, it will be in the links in the description below.
In the show notes, yeah, you can do that for sure.
Excellent. You can follow Frank at, I hope this is still true, Irrelevant Jokes.
Oh, yeah. You can find me everywhere on every platform as Irrelevant Jokes, and then I'm just happy to be part of the site, and then I definitely subscribe to that and check all the content out that's going to be coming out.
Excellent. One of our Patreon stretch goals that I'm very interested and excited for with Frank is that nostalgia show where you kind of pull somebody in and you like take a deep dive back into some random thing from the past that you have love for, because like when I think about you, that is the exact kind of obscure stuff you will super have fun with. So I'm hopeful we can hit that and make that show happen as well. Lastly, you can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey, because I did my whole rebranding a little while ago, no longer Snarky Starkey. You can follow me. I'm very much excited for this show. I'm excited for that Nerdy Site show, and just that Nerdy Site in general. It's been certainly keeping me busy for the last 5-6 months, whenever I've actually like started registering some of this stuff for this idea. And I'm so glad I'm not going it alone this time, because that might have broken me. To that vein, there will be a I will have kind of a big like launch celebration post that I'm going to be writing about kind of the inception and the idea behind this show, which this was the idea I had even before That Nerdy Site that got me back into wanting to create content. So that is one of the reasons that this show is very near and dear to me. So keep an eye out for that on thatnerdysite.com. You can follow all of us over there at That Nerdy Site, and like I said, at the website, we have most of the social medias, but this is also happening before, like a week before we launch. So we'll see what we actually have ready to go by the time this goes out to the masses. Hopefully, you can listen to it on podcast services. But yeah, please like, subscribe, everything you can do. Very much appreciated. Helps us kind of, especially as we're launching this thing. We definitely want to try and hit the ground running on this. As Logan mentioned, our launch weekend of November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, we will be streaming over at twitch.tv/thatnerdysite. Hopefully, assuming we can get all that tech to work and all that stuff. I'm even going to be out in Austin for that, so we'll be having a good time.
Gonna hug
there.
Trevor so fucking hard, man.
And yeah, if you like what you heard, if you are excited about any of this stuff, of course, please patreon.com/thatnerdysite. That is helping us cover all the costs and expenses of this brand new exciting venture. So that's it for this week's episode of That Ultimate Video Game List Show. Please let us know on Twitter, rate, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Let us know what you think, and let us know what games you would want added to this list, what we've missed out, what we've eliminated that you are going to think is egregious of us. Please let us know.
Somebody's real mad at the Game Boy Advance, already been taken off the table.
Yep.
They're already commenting in the YouTube section. It's like, oh,
those Advanced Wars diehards.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
You know, you say that, but like, don't test them. They are out there.
Yeah, no. Some like whatever Fire Emblems were on Game Boy Advance, somebody's gonna be really pissed at me. So yeah, that's the show. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week. I don't have an outro tag yet figured out for this show, so
we'll figure it out, man.
We'll identify it as we go. Until next time, stay nerdy and be good to each other.